This lesson, we're going to be looking at the items that are contained within the grid. So we do have 6 divs, and we've got them numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we've got classes that are associated with those. So we can make a selection. So first, we've already got the container selected, background of red. We've given it a display value of grid. Let's set up our grid structure where we've got the grid template. And we'll create, using the grid template columns, we'll create 2 columns. Go back out and refresh it, and that gives us 2 columns to work with. We can also maybe add in one more column. And the more items you have contained within the grid, the more flexibility you're going to have with this one, because this is going to be specifying where the grid items, where it will start and where it will end before the end of the column. So if we have 3 columns, and if we do have 4 columns, and I know we don't have enough items there to cover the 4 columns, but if we want to stretch this element over to 3 and then add in a few extra ones, we can do that. So let's make a selection of the element, and it has a class of 1. And we're going to apply the properties for the grid column. So specifying the grid column, and this is where we can identify a start as well as an end column where we want this element to start and end. So let's refresh, and that's going to start on 1 and end just before 3. So that's going to give us a 2 column. If we want 1 to stretch 3, then we can set it to 1 over 4, and that's going to set it to start on 1 and end just before 4. If we want it to go all the way across, so let's do another one where we'll select 2 and also apply the grid column value to this one. So what do you think is going to happen now when we set 2, because 2 is getting those values where it's going, and 1, there's nothing here left that for the value for it to take, because 2 is across 3 columns starting at 1 and ending on 3, so there's no spacing for that element. So let's update this to 3, and we'll change this to start on 2 and end on 5, just before 5. So that moves it over to the left-hand side, and now let's update this element to be 4 so that we do have that one element that can take the spot, to take that empty space, so that we don't have the red background. And lastly, let's divide up 5 and 6 across 2 columns each. So let's select the element class of 5, and using the grid column, we'll start it at 1 and we'll end it before 3. And number 6 will start on 2 and end before 5, or start on 3 and end before 5, and see what this looks like. So now we've split up 5 and 6 evenly across the bottom row, and we've got 1 and 4 taking up 3 columns each. You can also set this to specify how many it wants to span. So if we want to span 2 columns, we can set it that way, and that's going to produce the same results. So we can specify how many columns we want to span and specifying the start column. So if we want to start on 3 and we want to span 2 columns, and this will produce the same result for 5 and 6. So let's check out the grid row. So I'm going to comment out all of these ones to avoid any of the confusion. And you can use them in combination, but it does get fairly difficult. So selecting the element with a class of 1, using grid row this time, so it's going to be affecting the number of rows that it's going to be covering. So we'll start on row number 1 and we'll end on row number 4. And refresh. So we only have the 2 rows, so that's why it's not taking up any additional rows. If I got rid of some of these to give me more rows, it will expand to cover all of the rows. So it's going to do the 3 rows that way. Also, let's for number 3, I'll set that one to, let me just see which row it's starting off. So it's still starting off on row number 1. So grid row, starting at 1, and let it span 2 rows. So it's going to do the same thing that, almost literally the same thing almost that we saw with 1, but it's only going to take up the 2 rows. And then again, this is fully responsive. And notice that 2 got shifted over because that's where the space was in the parent element. And that's why sometimes it does get a little bit confusing when you are using the grid row alongside with the column, the grid column. So there's also a way to do the grid area. So let me copy these and I'll just put it into where we've got it commented so we can reference them at later. So select the elements. So the grid area property allows you to specify where you want to place an item. So the syntax is the grid row start, the grid column start, the grid row end, and the grid column end. So this one is fairly complex. Let's try to add that in where we're going to select the elements, and actually we're going to select element number 3. So we're going to start 3 using grid area. So this is going to be the starting row. So start it on row number 1. And we'll start the column on column number 2. And I'm going to add in 1 additional column. And so where do we want it to end? Let's end it on row number 3. And also going to end it on column number 4. And I'll add in another column there to see how that looks. So essentially we were able to position it kind of centered here, and notice as well that it's centered between 1 and 2 and 4 and 5, and that's because we've got the starting at row 1 and column 2, so that would be starting here, and then it gets positioned all the way to the row end and then the column end. So the row end and the column end spot. So try it out and try the grid area, the grid row, the grid column, and get a feel for how you can position your elements that are within the container, and you can be ready to move on to the next lesson.